On the night of January 22, 1948, the House of Commons in London was not exactly packed. There were no television cameras, no global headlines waiting to run the next morning. Just a tired, overweight, working-class former union boss named Ernest Bevin, standing up in front of a half-empty chamber to deliver a speech that almost nobody outside that room thought would matter. Bevin was Britain's foreign secretary, a man who'd left school at 11, who'd spent his life organizing dockworkers before he ever set foot near a foreign ministry. And on that night, exhausted, half-broke Britain, a country still rationing bread 3 years after winning a world war, stood up and told the world it wanted to build something no one had ever built before. A peacetime alliance that would eventually pull the most powerful, most isolationist nation on Earth into a permanent military commitment on European soil. That speech is not the story you've heard. The story you've heard starts more than a year later, on April 4, 1949, with 12 foreign ministers gathered in Washington to sign the North Atlantic Treaty. It's a clean story. Stalin was threatening Europe, the free world needed a shield, America stepped up, and NATO was born as the great military bulwark against Soviet tanks pouring through the Fulda Gap. It's the story taught in most high school textbooks and repeated in most documentaries. And it's not exactly false, but it leaves out almost everything that actually explains why NATO exists, who really built it, what it was actually designed to do, and why the man most responsible for the strategy behind it spent the rest of his life insisting the alliance had become something he never intended. Because here's what most people don't know. NATO wasn't primarily an American idea, it was a British one. The treaty that founded it doesn't read like a war pact, it reads like a document written by people trying to avoid an automatic war pact. The alliance that we think of today, tanks, jets, a unified command structure, American generals stationed across Europe, didn't exist for its first year and a half of existence. It had no soldiers, no bases, no commander. And the argument over what NATO was supposed to be, a political club of frightened democracies or an actual standing army, split the very people who created it. One of America's most respected diplomats fought against the alliance's creation from inside the State Department and spent the next 5 decades of his life warning that it had drifted catastrophically from what containment was ever supposed to mean. So let's actually go back and trace how this happened, because the real story of NATO's origin is stranger, more contested, and far more revealing about the fragility of the post-war order than the version you've been told. To understand why Bevin stood up in that chamber in January of 1948, you have to understand what Europe actually looked like at that moment. The Second World War had ended less than 3 years earlier, and the continent hadn't come close to recovering. Cities across Germany, France, Poland, and the Low Countries were still in ruins. Industrial output across much of Europe remained far below pre-war levels. Britain itself, despite standing on the winning side, was functionally bankrupt, having spent itself into enormous debt to fight the war, and it was still operating under wartime rationing. The old European balance of power, the system of competing empires that had defined the continent for centuries, was gone. In its place stood 2 new poles of gravity, an exhausted, fractured Western Europe and an increasingly assertive Soviet Union that had pushed its army and its political influence deep into Eastern and Central Europe by the time the fighting stopped. Washington's own posture toward Europe had already started shifting before any of this, though not yet toward a military alliance. In March of 1947, President Truman went before Congress to ask for aid to Greece and Turkey, both of which he argued were threatened by communist pressure. And in doing so, he articulated what became known as the Truman Doctrine, the idea that the United States would support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressure. A few months later, in June of 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall proposed what would become the Marshall Plan, a massive American economic aid package aimed at rebuilding Western European economies so thoroughly that communism would have nothing to feed on. Both of these were significant departures from pre-war American habits, but both were still economic and political tools, not military ones. The Truman Doctrine promised money and advisors. The Marshall Plan promised reconstruction funding. Neither one promised American soldiers or an automatic commitment to go to war. That distinction is exactly what made the idea of a binding military alliance the next, much larger, leap. And it's why Bevan's push in early 1948 was asking Washington for something categorically different from what it had already agreed to. And there was a deeper problem underneath all of it, one that America in particular had never really confronted. The United States had a long tradition, stretching back to George Washington's farewell address warning against entangling alliances, of refusing permanent peacetime military commitments outside its own hemisphere. Even after 2 world wars, the American default was to demobilize, pull troops home, and let Europe sort out its own security. Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman's administrations had leaned into a more internationalist posture, building the United Nations and launching the Marshall Plan in 1947 to rebuild European economies. But an actual binding military alliance, a treaty that could drag American soldiers into a European war automatically, was still, as late as 1947, considered politically almost unthinkable in Washington. That is the wall that had to come down before NATO could exist, and it didn't come down because Washington wanted it to. It came down because London pushed, and because a series of shocks in 1948 made the alternative look far more dangerous than the risk of entanglement. Bevan had actually started laying the groundwork before that January speech. In March of 1947, Britain and France signed the Treaty of Dunkirk, a bilateral mutual assistance pact, on the surface aimed at preventing any resurgence of German aggression, though in practice both governments understood the deeper concern was the Soviet Union. It was a modest step, but it established a principle. Post-war Britain was willing to bind itself militarily to its European neighbors, something it had historically resisted. Then, in January of 1948, with talks among the wartime Allied foreign ministers over Germany's future having collapsed weeks earlier in London, Bevan decided the moment had come to go further and go public. In that House of Commons speech, he called for what he termed a Western Union, a defensive alliance among the democracies of Western Europe, explicitly framed within the structure of the United Nations Charter but built around a hard core of mutual military commitment. He named the countries he wanted to bring in: Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, eventually Norway, Denmark, Italy, and in some future form even a rebuilt, democratic Germany. It was an extraordinary ask for a broke, war-weary nation to make. And it worked, at least as a starting point, because 6 weeks later, the world handed Bevan exactly the kind of crisis that made his case for him. On February 25, 1948, the Communist Party seized full control of the government of Czechoslovakia in what's remembered as the Czechoslovak coup. It wasn't a war. There was no invasion. It was closer to a slow-motion political strangulation, communist ministers maneuvering, non-communist officials resigning or being pushed out, and within days, a single-party communist state stood where a fragile multi-party democracy had been. For Western European leaders already anxious about Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe, the Czechoslovak coup landed like a thunderclap. It seemed to confirm the darkest reading of Soviet strategy, that Moscow intended to absorb the whole of the continent, one government at a time, through subversion rather than open invasion, and that no country was safe simply because it wasn't touching Soviet tanks. That fear accelerated everything. 3 weeks later, on March 17, 1948, Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg signed the Treaty of Brussels, formally creating the Western Union Bevan had proposed, a 5-nation mutual defense pact with a joint commitment that an armed attack on one would be treated as an attack on all. But Bevan and the other Brussels Treaty architects knew from the start that 5 worn-out European nations, no matter how tightly bound together on paper, could not actually deter the Soviet Union on their own. The entire point of the Brussels Treaty, in Bevan's own strategy, was never really about what those 5 countries alone could do. It was a demonstration, a signal to Washington that Europe was willing to organize itself and share the burden, in the hope that this would finally persuade the United States to extend a security guarantee across the Atlantic. And almost immediately, that's exactly what began to happen. In March of 1948, secret talks opened in Washington between American, British, and Canadian officials, sometimes called the Pentagon talks, exploring the outline of a broader North Atlantic security arrangement. These were quiet, deliberately unpublicized conversations, because the American side understood something the European side didn't have to worry about nearly as much. Before Washington could commit to anything, it needed political cover at home. That's where the story shifts from London and Brussels to the floor of the United States Senate, and to a Republican senator from Michigan named Arthur Vandenberg. Vandenberg had spent much of his earlier career as one of the loudest voices for American isolationism, a man who during the 1930s championed neutrality laws specifically designed to keep the United States out of European wars. Pearl Harbor changed him. By 1945, he had become one of the leading Republican voices for an internationalist American foreign policy, and he had already helped build bipartisan support for the Marshall Plan the year before. But a formal, binding American military alliance with European powers was a different order of commitment entirely, one that raised a genuine constitutional question. Under the U.S. Constitution, the power to declare war belongs to Congress, not the President. If the United States signed a treaty promising automatic military action the moment a European ally was attacked, was that treaty effectively letting a foreign government's crisis, or even a foreign government's political judgment, trigger an American war without a congressional vote? That tension had to be resolved before any alliance could survive Senate ratification. The resolution came through Vandenberg himself, working closely, and with unusual bipartisan cooperation, with Secretary of State George Marshall and Under Secretary Robert Lovett. Vandenberg drafted a resolution affirming that the United States could, through its constitutional processes, associate itself with regional collective security arrangements consistent with the United Nations Charter. On June 11, 1948, the Senate adopted the Vandenberg Resolution by a lopsided vote of 64 to 6. 1948 was also a presidential election year, which made the politics even more delicate. Truman was a Democrat running for a term. Many pundits at the time doubted he could win, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which Vandenberg chaired, was controlled by Republicans. Had this process become a partisan football, kicked around for electoral advantage, the entire alliance project could easily have stalled or collapsed before it ever reached a vote. Instead, Vandenberg and the Truman administration deliberately built the resolution through quiet, bipartisan negotiation, keeping the process largely out of the partisan spotlight and holding off on the most substantive treaty negotiations until after the November election, specifically so the alliance wouldn't get swept up in campaign politics. It's an easy detail to skip past, but it's a genuinely important one. The alliance historians now describe as one of the defining strategic achievements of the 20th century almost didn't survive its own government's domestic political calendar. It is genuinely difficult to overstate how significant the Vandenberg Resolution was. Without it, there almost certainly is no NATO, because no American administration in 1948 was going to try to ram a European military alliance through the Senate without this kind of bipartisan groundwork laid first. And notice what this reveals about the conventional story. NATO wasn't simply announced by a confident, dominant America extending protection to a grateful Europe. It was the product of a British diplomat spending over a year quietly maneuvering, a 5-nation European treaty designed partly as a lobbying tool aimed at Washington, and an American senator who had to personally engineer a political and constitutional workaround just to make it possible for the United States to say yes. Then came the event most people do remember, though usually stripped of its proper context. On June 24, 1948, just 2 weeks after the Vandenberg Resolution passed, the Soviet Union cut off all road, rail, and water access into the western sectors of Berlin, an island of Allied-controlled territory sitting deep inside the Soviet occupation zone of Germany. It was Moscow's response to Western moves toward creating an independent West German state and introducing a new currency in the Western zones, a currency reform Stalin viewed as a direct threat to Soviet control over the region. For nearly 11 months, American and British aircraft flew in a continuous stream of food, coal, and medicine to keep 2 million West Berliners alive, an operation now remembered as the Berlin Airlift. The blockade didn't end until May of 1949, more than a month after NATO's founding treaty had already been signed. This matters because the popular version of NATO's origin often treats the Berlin blockade as the singular spark that created the alliance, the moment America realized it needed to act. The reality is more layered. The blockade was a powerful accelerant, absolutely. It hardened Western public opinion, gave Vandenberg's Senate colleagues a vivid, immediate justification to point to, and injected real urgency into the ongoing Washington negotiations. But the negotiations were already well underway before a single Soviet roadblock went up outside Berlin. The blockade didn't start the process. It poured fuel onto a fire Bevin had already lit 16 months earlier, and that the Czechoslovak coup had already stoked in February. By the time Stalin moved on Berlin, the machinery for an Atlantic alliance was already turning. Still, it's worth pausing on just how close-run the Berlin crisis actually was, because it shaped the psychology of everyone negotiating the treaty in Washington that same year. For months, American and British aircrews kept roughly 2 million West Berliners fed, heated, and supplied by air alone, at one point landing a plane in the city every couple of minutes around the clock. The only way the Soviets could have physically stopped it was to shoot down an Allied aircraft, an act that would have meant open war. Neither side wanted that, and the standoff dragged on for nearly 11 months as a grinding test of nerve rather than a single dramatic confrontation. When Stalin finally lifted the blockade in May of 1949, it read as a clear demonstration that the Soviets could be resisted without a shooting war, but also as a stark reminder of exactly how fragile the peace in Europe actually was. Diplomats sitting in Washington, finalizing the North Atlantic Treaty's language that spring were doing so with that airlift still running over their heads. It's difficult to overstate how much that daily, visible standoff shaped the political will to finish what Bevin had started over a year earlier. On April 4, 1949, in Washington, D.C., with the Berlin airlift still running overhead in Europe, foreign ministers from 12 nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty. The 5 Brussels Treaty powers, Belgium, France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom, were joined by the United States, Canada, Italy, Portugal, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. Ernest Bevin himself was in the room, and he called it a day of consecration for peace and resistance to aggression. Here is where the popular understanding of the treaty tends to go furthest wrong. Most people assume Article 5, the alliance's famous collective defense clause, functions like a tripwire, that an attack on any single member automatically triggers every other member to go to war on its behalf. That is not what the treaty actually says. Article 5 states that an armed attack against one member will be considered an attack against all of them, but it commits each member only to take such action as it deems necessary, which explicitly includes the use of armed force, but does not require it, and it specifies that each nation will act in accordance with its constitutional processes. That final phrase was inserted specifically to satisfy the American Senate's insistence that Congress, not a treaty, retain the constitutional authority to declare war. NATO's founding document was engineered, quite deliberately, to be a serious deterrent promise without being an automatic war machine. That ambiguity was a feature, not an accident, and it was the price of getting the treaty through the U.S. Senate at all. And here's the detail that surprises almost everyone once they learn it. For roughly its first year and a half of existence, NATO had no integrated military command whatsoever, no shared headquarters, no supreme commander, no standing multinational force. It was, in its earliest form, essentially a political and diplomatic pact, a mutual promise on paper backed by loosely coordinated national militaries and regional planning committees, not the sprawling, unified military alliance most people picture when they hear the name today. The organization we recognize now, with its command structure, its bases, its joint exercises, simply did not exist in 1949. That machinery was built later, and the reason it was built reveals another layer of the story that gets flattened in the popular narrative: the fight over what NATO was actually supposed to be for. That fight had a name and a face, and it was happening inside the U.S. State Department even as the treaty was being negotiated. George Kennan is remembered today as the intellectual architect of American Cold War strategy, the diplomat whose 1946 long telegram from Moscow and his 1947 anonymous Mr. X article in Foreign Affairs laid out the doctrine of containment, the idea that the United States should resist Soviet expansion through patient, sustained pressure until the internal contradictions of the Soviet system caused it to weaken or reform from within. What almost nobody remembers is that Kennan, the man whose ideas gave the Cold War its intellectual foundation, was deeply opposed to the creation of NATO. As head of the State Department's policy planning staff, Kennan argued forcefully that his concept of containment had always been meant as political, economic, and psychological, using tools like the Marshall Plan to strengthen democratic societies so communism couldn't take root, not a permanent, militarized division of Europe into two armed camps. He didn't believe the Soviet Union was preparing to invade Western Europe militarily, and he worried that building a formal Western military alliance, especially one that would eventually require rearming Germany, would foreclose any realistic possibility of a negotiated settlement with Moscow and lock the continent into permanent confrontation. Kennan wasn't alone in his skepticism, though his fellow travelers came from a very different direction. On the isolationist right, Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, one of the most influential Republicans in the Senate and no ally of Kennan's worldview, also opposed the North Atlantic Treaty, warning that it represented exactly the kind of permanent entangling commitment the American founders had cautioned against, and that it risked provoking rather than deterring Moscow. So the treaty that eventually passed the Senate 82-13 in the summer of 1949 did so over the objections of both a leading progressive-minded internationalist strategist inside the government and a leading conservative isolationist inside the Senate, for almost opposite reasons. Kennan lost that argument decisively, and in his own later writings and memoirs, he remained bitter about it for the rest of his long life, insisting that what he called containment had been hijacked into something far more militarized, more rigid, and more dangerous than what he'd originally proposed. For the alliance's first year, Kennan's vision, a lighter touch, largely political pact, was closer to reality than the militarized NATO of popular imagination. That changed almost overnight because of a war fought thousands of miles from the North Atlantic. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces invaded South Korea, and the shock of that invasion rippled straight through the capitals of Western Europe. If Stalin, or a Soviet-aligned regime, was willing to launch an armed invasion in Asia, NATO's member governments reasoned, what confidence could anyone have that a similar move wouldn't eventually come in Europe, particularly across the fault line running through a divided Germany? Korea exposed just how thin NATO's actual military substance was. There was no integrated command, no unified force structure, no single officer responsible for coordinating the defense of the continent. Within months, the alliance moved to fix that. In December of 1950, the North Atlantic Council announced that General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the celebrated World War II Supreme Allied Commander, would become NATO's first Supreme Allied Commander Europe, or SACEUR. Eisenhower arrived in Paris in January of 1951, and by April of that year, the alliance had activated Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE, its first genuine integrated military command. This is the actual moment NATO transformed from a political promise on paper into the standing, unified military alliance we recognize today. And it happened more than 2 years after the treaty was originally signed, triggered not by anything happening in the North Atlantic at all, but by a war on the Korean Peninsula. Running underneath almost every stage of this story is a question that rarely gets its due weight in popular retellings: the German question. Germany had started 2 catastrophic wars in 30 years, and every country around the negotiating table, especially France, was haunted by the fear of a resurgent German military as much as by the fear of Soviet tanks. NATO's first Secretary General, Lord Ismay, is widely remembered for summarizing the alliance's underlying purpose with a blunt, memorable phrase. The goal, he said, was to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Whether or not Ismay's exact wording is airtight as an official quotation, the sentiment it captures was very real and shaped the alliance's structure for years. West Germany was not one of the 12 founding members in 1949 at all. It took until 1955, after years of difficult negotiation over how, or whether, to rearm a German state only a decade removed from Nazi rule, for West Germany to formally join NATO. And it was precisely that step, the integration of a rearmed West Germany into a Western military alliance, that pushed Moscow to respond in kind. Just days after West Germany's accession to NATO in May of 1955, the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellite states formed the Warsaw Pact, the mirror-image alliance that would face off against NATO for the rest of the Cold War. In other words, the Iron Curtain's most famous military standoff, NATO versus the Warsaw Pact, didn't spring into existence in 1949. It was still being assembled, piece by contested piece, 6 years later. So when you pull all these threads together, the actual origin of NATO looks very different from the tidy story of an American superpower stepping forward to shield a helpless Europe from Soviet aggression. It starts with a broke, exhausted British government and a former Union organizer who understood, faster than almost anyone in Washington, that European security and American commitment were now inseparable. It runs through a political coup in Czechoslovakia that turned abstract anxiety into concrete fear, and through a 5-nation European treaty that functioned as much as a lobbying tool aimed at Congress as a genuine defense pact in its own right. It required an American senator to personally solve a constitutional puzzle before his own government could even consider signing on, and it produced a treaty deliberately written to avoid being an automatic declaration of war machine. It was fiercely contested from the very beginning by the man whose own ideas had supposedly inspired it, a diplomat who spent decades afterward insisting the alliance had drifted from his original intent. And the version of NATO most people actually picture, with its unified command, its American generals, its integrated forces, wasn't born on April 4, 1949 at all. It was built in the shadow of a completely different war, on a completely different continent, more than a year and a half later. None of this is a story about a single villain or a single hero. Bevin wasn't wrong to push for an alliance, and the fear driving Western European leaders in 1948 wasn't manufactured. It was grounded in the very real experience of watching Czechoslovakia's democracy collapse in a matter of days and watching Stalin try to strangle Berlin into submission. Kennan wasn't wrong that a permanent, militarized division of Europe carried real long-term risks either. Both things can be true. That's what tends to get lost when history gets compressed into a one-sentence explanation, that the depth of the disagreement, the genuine uncertainty felt by the people making these decisions in real time, gets sanded down into a story of obvious necessity and inevitable outcomes. Nothing about NATO's creation was inevitable. It was contested at nearly every step. By isolationists on the right, by containment's own architect on the left, and by a constitutional structure that nearly made the whole thing impossible before it started. It's also worth remembering that none of these were abstract policy debates for the people living through them. For a British public still on ration books, agreeing to a permanent continental military commitment meant real, ongoing sacrifice on top of a war they'd already paid for in blood and treasure. For West Germans, the question of rearmament, of putting a uniform back on a generation that had only just taken one off, was not a theoretical exercise in alliance building. It was an agonizing reckoning with their own recent history, debated for years before West Germany's government agreed to it. For American families, the Vandenberg Resolution and the treaty that followed represented the quiet, unglamorous moment their country stopped being able to sit an ocean away from Europe's problems, a shift most people alive at the time had been raised to believe their country would never make. These weren't inevitable historical currents. They were choices, made by specific people, under real pressure, with no guarantee of how they'd turn out. Why does any of this matter almost 80 years later? Because the underlying questions being argued out in 1948 and 1949, how far a security commitment should extend, what should actually trigger collective action, whether deeper military integration produces stability or forecloses diplomatic off-ramps, how a rearmed or resurgent power should be handled inside an alliance built to contain it, are the same categories of questions still being argued about NATO today. Just with different countries occupying different roles. Reasonable people disagree, now as then, about how those questions should be answered, and that's not a new phenomenon the alliance stumbled into recently. It was baked into NATO's DNA from its very first year, when the man who inspired containment was fighting his own government over what the alliance should even be. Understanding that NATO was born out of genuine, unresolved disagreement among its own architects, rather than some singular, obvious strategic consensus that everyone in 1949 simply agreed on, changes how you should think about the arguments happening over its future now. History rarely hands us clean origin stories. It hands us people working with incomplete information, competing fears, and imperfect compromises, and NATO's founding is a textbook example of exactly that. If you want the version of history that doesn't get flattened into a single sentence, the kind of research that actually goes back to the treaty text, the Senate votes, and the private disagreements between the people who built these institutions, that's what this channel is built around. Hit subscribe if you want more of it, because there's a lot more of this era we haven't even touched yet. And since I know most of you watching are here in the States, drop a comment and tell me what state you're texting from. I'm curious how far this reaches. Let me know too, which part of this story surprised you the most, Bevan's role, Kennan's descent, or the fact that NATO didn't even have a military command for its first 2 years. I'll see you in the next one.